Hello there, how are you doing? Hope that you are doing well. I feel like it's been a little while since I did a video because Hong Kong has, to be perfectly honest, been absolutely insane for the past few weeks. I don't know if you read stuff in the press saying, oh, Hong Kong's been really quiet for a while, and certainly we were during COVID. But literally in the last month, there's been so much going on. We had FinTech week here, which was absolutely massive. I've been involved with the thing in terms of helping startups here in Hong Kong at the moment. We have people from the UK flying in to see how they can promote themselves in the Hong Kong market. And in terms of building a market for tech, it feels like something's just clicked into gear. That perhaps we were a little bit overdue for, that perhaps we needed. So it's a very, very exciting time, although I feel like I have massive circles under my eyes from the amount of not sleeping that I've been doing and talking about technology, AI, data privacy, you name it. It seems to be all go at the moment. We've had a few interesting things happen. There's a lot happening in AI, which in terms of how it's being used, we're kind of a year now into generative AI really being a thing. So that's been big in Hong Kong. And I'll be giving a talk, actually moderating a talk on AI in December, which if you follow me on LinkedIn, I will post a link to it and you'll be able to sign up and probably watch it from there. I'm also doing talks in terms of data privacy and how AI has affected that for essentially for information security officers, which again is a bit of a pet topic of mine. So AI is huge. Data privacy has been pretty big in terms of we've now got a little bit of guidance from China as to what's going to happen with their data privacy laws. Not enough for me to really do a full video, but I will do one soon. In fact, my next video, which will be December, I mean, heavens, it's mid-November now as I'm recording this, like dead on mid-November, will be focusing on my predictions for 2020. Oh my God, it feels like the future. For 2024. Wow, 2024, we're way beyond all of the sci-fi movies that I remember where they were set, but there we go, but who knows. But instead, for this video, I'm going to focus on something that's a bit more, maybe not as mainstream, but something I found quite interesting. I'd like to thank a friend of mine called Paul Coe for giving me the idea for this video. When I say give me the idea, I was at a technology event, I think it was an AI event, I'm at a lot of AI events lately, where he said, oh, why don't you talk about sanctions? And specifically things to do with open source software. Now, living in Hong Kong, we're part of China. It's hard not to read the news about what's going on in terms of the tech war. The US, China, well, let's face it, it's kind of global now, tech war, which is not new in any way. If you go back in my sort of list of videos that I've got on YouTube or on LinkedIn, some of the earliest things I was talking about was the ways that, certainly when Donald Trump was president, the ways to try and stifle the innovation in China, prevent China getting access to Western technology, and then China bouncing back saying, well, we're going to try and sanction people in the US. And it's been a little bit like kids throwing sticks at each other across the playground in some ways. And that hasn't really gone away. Probably about 2 or 3 months ago, Huawei released a phone which is using new technology that they thought would be impossible for China to create itself, that it could only do it if it was having technology that was coming from the West. And that really brought into sort of sharp relief the fact that we now really have these competing West and East divides in terms of development of technology, who will be the sort of the dominant technology provider in the future. China is doing some incredible things, but then so is the US. And what I think is now happening is that they're trying to block access within China, certainly in Russia, to Western technology to try and stifle their innovation a bit, make sure there's no sort of stealing of IP, which China is certainly often accused of, rather rightly or wrongly, and really making sure that each, it's not even a state, but each region tries to keep its own competitive advantage. One of the things that I found really interesting was if you read back, there was a solar panel business that was in Europe, which was pretty much destroyed by cheap solar panels coming out of China. A similar thing's now happening in terms of electric vehicles. Like China is the biggest producer of electric vehicles, and they've got pretty big foothold now in China. There's an attempt to try and stop them coming, essentially destroying an industry that's fairly nascent in both Europe and in the US. And it's protectionism, quite simply. But then China does a lot of protectionist activities within its own market. It very much wants to make sure that its market succeeds rather than having a complete free market economy. So it's interesting. And sanctions are essentially used to stop people supplying or trading with a particular entity. So you can have sanctions just on an individual company. You see those quite a lot. We saw those from Donald Trump, who worryingly could be president again soon, but we'll have to see what happens there. But what we're seeing now is more of just preventing some states, and I really mean China, from getting any access to technology at all. And that's normally pretty easy to do. So if you're a provider of technology, if you're NVIDIA, it's a good example in terms of their AI chips, and the US says you are not allowed to deliver chips to X market, probably, well, it is China in this case. They can't have the most advanced AI chips. They're just for us. And if you breach it, we will either fine you, you'll be subject to sanctions, you may not be able to trade in the US dollar if it goes really far, but you certainly might not be able to trade with US partners. And of course, the US market is one of the biggest in the world, probably only level pegging to or second to China. Then you abide by it. And sanctions are a very effective way to do this. Well, sanctions on hardware are relatively easy. As a lawyer, I've been involved in cases where stuff's been shipped around the world to places it shouldn't have been. A good example is, for example, shipping sensitive technology to Iran, which is normally prevented by sanctions from the US. But it becomes a lot harder when you're not dealing with things that are tangible assets, that are tangible hardware or something like money, and when you're actually trading in software. Now, there's two elements to this. It becomes harder in software, not in terms of necessarily stopping lots of disks on a boat going somewhere, we're way beyond that, but in terms of the transmission of technology from one state to the next. I mean, everything will happen through the internet. Maybe in some cases, somebody will just post something, but I doubt it. Now, there's two elements to this. If you are someone like Microsoft or a large software provider or Google or Apple, to the extent that they do the software element to their devices, and you say that they're not allowed to supply to a certain state, that they can't supply to China, that's fairly easy to police. If you find that someone has got access to whatever this obvious technology is, and then you know that they're using it, you do a quick investigation, you sanction essentially the people who are providing it. You would then say not only not sanction them, not only you would essentially breach sanctions on China, so you would be fined for doing that. And certainly I've been involved in cases where companies have been fined for either rightly, wrongly, or mistakenly, normally mistakenly, supplying technology to a state-owned enterprise or a company within a particular state that they didn't realize they weren't supposed to. And it's messy, not something you want to get involved in. If you want to make a lot of money, become a US sanctions lawyer, because it's very complicated and you need a lot of expertise. That's fine. But that's fine, again, where software has an obvious source, where it's being provided by someone. One of the things that I was asked by a friend of mine, by Paul, was what about open source software? How do you sanction open source software? Now, if you don't know what open source software is, it's something that's created by someone and essentially released, normally for free. You're normally subject to some sort of open source license, but it's free with very few limitations of what you can do. And it is prevalent. I guarantee that every day you are using some sort of device or software or equipment that incorporates some element of open source software into it. It's just the way the world works. The world does very much run on open source software, and it's easy to obtain. It's key in terms of developing new solutions, new software, new hardware, everything. Without open source software, development of things kind of falls apart. It is very, very important. And open source software pretty much has no borders. Because it's free, you're not buying it. Your license conditions normally state that if you're using it, you have to state that you're using it, often no more than that. It's very rare that even if you're using it for commercial purposes. And what I recommend you do, if you're very bored or a bit of a tech nerd, is have a look at the end user license agreement or the terms and conditions of any software you're using. There'll be a section somewhere, or even if you're playing a video game, if it's even better, you get to the credits, it'll tell you what software has been incorporated into it. And look at how much of that is actually open source that's been generated by someone that someone is essentially using for free. So how do you stop someone from using open source software? You can't ban software. You can't ban something that's essentially ethereal, lives on the internet these days, and stop it being transmitted. It can go through any source. Now, I don't think it's possible, but what we're seeing now is essentially where, if the US is going ahead and essentially planning sanctions on open source software, planning essentially sanctions that prevent the transmission of open source software to people who doesn't want to have it, they would have to kind of ask, and I saw someone say this out, this is my quote, open source software to ban itself. And it doesn't have, it doesn't have personality. It can't really ban itself. But I started thinking about it a bit more. Now, you must be familiar with GitHub and various code repositories, lots of which exist around the world. GitHub is probably the most famous. People create code, they upload it, they share it. Open source software is almost always hosted up there. Most of the open source software that I get hold of, that I'm using day to day, not using it that much day to day, I have to say, remember, I am a lawyer, not necessarily a coder, is coming from GitHub. To be fair, most of it involves with organizing record collections or playing video games. There we are. But what essentially the sanctions could do is mean that anyone who obtains and supplies or is involved indirectly in the supply of open source software to a sanctioned entity would then be faced to the same penalties as anyone else who'd breached a sanction. Now, that would essentially mean that GitHub, which is a global thing and anyone can access it, would suddenly have to bring down its own sort of great open source firewall, prevent it working. And I did think surely that isn't possible, but having looked at GitHub's response to how open source works, they're very much, we don't want this to happen, but we feel we don't want to have to close down. But if we are facing essentially massive fines for allowing open source software to be used, we'll be stuck. And yeah, I suppose you could sanction it. You could essentially not sanction the software itself, but what you would instead do is, well, really, I suppose you'd be sanctioning the people who are making it available, and also really damaging the open source market. If those are hosting the software think that there's a danger in doing so and they may be fined, they'd probably feel like a Pirate Bay or a torrent site, that they're somehow giving away stuff they shouldn't be giving away, and therefore they could face massive financial penalty. And the worst case scenario to that is that something like GitHub just becomes very restrictive, requiring more registration. It doesn't allow people to actually use code. And as it happens pretty much every time I talk about technology sanctions, you just stifle innovation and the whole world becomes a bit less restricted, hived off, shouty, I suppose. And the world is pretty shouty at the moment. So I'm hoping it doesn't happen. The thing is, I don't see how, even if you were to try and make open source software sort of sanction itself, essentially say that it won't provide certain states, that seems completely meaningless, because all that will happen is that it will go through the dark web. People will get access to it. It's one of those things that once it's released, it's not going to be easy for someone to go after. The next thing that people would have to do, so whoever was trying to impose the sanction would then have to try and fine the software creators. And that would be a massively detrimental effect on software development, not just in the place that you're trying to stop having access to the software, but worldwide. People will think, well, why would I make this software, this useful software, available for free when all I'm doing is essentially opening myself up to some sort of legal issues? Most coders aren't making a massive amount of money creating this stuff, so they probably wouldn't want to do it anymore. And again, we end up stifled. Innovation that we've seen in the last few years doesn't happen, or someone just tries to get ChatGPT to write all of their code and it may or may not work, who knows? So we will see. I am hopeful that sense will prevail, that people think that open source software is generally something that you cannot sanction, you cannot prevent it being supplied. But then I was also of the view that essentially sanctions, technology sanctions in general, unless they're applied on a very light touch basis, really stifle global innovation and cooperation in general. But maybe the world isn't really going for a global cooperation approach these days. It feels that we're becoming more and more sort of trapped, I suppose, in a box where we don't really know what we're going to do. Legally, yeah, there's plenty of things you can do. It's easy enough to uphold a sanction and fine somebody and go after somebody if you can find out they've breached it. But practically, it really, really has pretty much no effect. I mean, if you think about it, some of the sanctions on provision of hardware around the world, they aren't really having as much an effect as people would think. Look at what's been happening in Russia following the Ukraine invasion. Russia's been hit by sanctions, but they seem to be doing pretty well. There's plenty of ways around it in the way the world is today. So we'll see. Yeah, but I guess not often that I come to a distinct conclusion, but I think the idea of actually trying to sanction open source software is just generally a bad idea. You could prevent some software being used within your territory, which is very different. When you look at people who are banning certain apps within their territory, that's fine, that's within their remit. But preventing someone else doing it, it's a little bit like, when you go to a playground, you're not very happy, but you own the football, so you take the football home so nobody else can have it and nobody else can have fun. In fact, that's a pretty good analogy to end on. And I hope that was interesting. Again, thank you, Paul, for asking me to talk about it. Again, let's see what happens. I fear the way that the world is going at the moment, and the way that we may have a change of US president in the not too distant future, that things could get a little bit hairy in terms of the freedom of technology that we would like to have around the world. And my sort of vision, my excitement when I was relatively young, no, I was young, and I thought, wow, this internet thing is incredible. I've just discovered it, and it was still relatively new, and I communicate and share things with people all around the world. But that freedom may be going. That's part of a bigger worry. Anyway, that's a bit depressing. I will be back relatively soon. Do sign up to go and see some of my talks. The one that I'm doing on AI is online. The other one, I'm afraid, is not, but I'm always happy to share slides, and I'll promote it on LinkedIn. So follow me on LinkedIn if you don't do that already, and let me know if there's anything you'd like me to talk about. Also, what are your thoughts on what's going to happen in 2024? Because I will use some of those to shape my predictions video, which will be coming at some point in December, probably towards the end of December, depending how busy I am. Certainly, I've been very busy at the moment. Hong Kong, if you've got like a week or two to spare, now is the time to come to Hong Kong. Not only is it absolutely buzzing, but the weather's really good as well. It's not too hot. Anyway, that's it for the moment. Until next time, have a good one, and I'll see you very soon.